All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for bearing with us. How's everyone? Good? Ready to start? So the good thing is we had a very uncertain start, and that's the topic of today's discussion. I think you can tell we're in the vibe. Right, so welcome everyone. We've got about an hour, well, technically an hour 30. I think it's going to be an hour 15 now. So we may have to shorten a bit. So my name is Sophie. I am the communications manager at Flowminder, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's discussion. And we've got 4 lovely panelists who are representing a different perspective on the world of data production for humanitarian action. So before I get started, we've also got some people online, so welcome. And we've also got Gemma from Flowminder, who's going to be our online moderator. So hopefully it's all going to work out fine. So before I introduce the panelists, I would like to actually understand who's in the room. So can I have some hands up if you are a data user for humanitarian action? Same in the chat, if you can just write in the chat. Hands up if you are a data producer. Maybe hands up if you're from academia. And then because I can't do all categories, hands up if you are something else. So give us an idea, which is the majority. Brilliant. Welcome, everyone. Right, so today we're going to be discussing communicating uncertainty. So there is going to be some discussion about how we can best communicate data and how we can make it useful and usable for the different data users in the humanitarian sector. But we're also going to talk about how we communicate uncertainty, because most of the data we produce are estimates, and they come with some degrees of uncertainty, which could affect decision-making and reliability of analysis because of the doubt associated with it. So to get started, I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. So we've got Yevhen Barshevsky, who's the data analytics team lead at ACAPS. And ACAPS, I'm sure you know who they are, but a quick introduction, they actually monitor 160 plus humanitarian crises all around the globe, 24/7, and they actually produce a series of data around crisis severity, access constraint, risk identification, and many more. We've also got Ellie Kam from ClearGlobal, who's the strategic partnership director. And ClearGlobal are a leading authority in the world of language data. So they provide vital information so everyone in the world can be heard and listened to and communicate properly, regardless of the language they speak. So it's all about breaking the language barriers in the humanitarian sector. We've got Humanitarian OpenStreetMap with JC Peshman, Humanitarian GIS and Data Protection Leads. Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team is dedicated to humanitarian actions and community development through open mapping, and you provide a lot of data around disaster management to reduce risks and also support the sustainable development goals. And finally, we've got Daniel Power, Managing Director at Flowminder. So Flowminder is the global leaders in mobile data analytics for development purposes and humanitarian action. And they use mobile phone data, geospatial data, and survey data to support decision-making in time of crisis and for statistics. So I hope you're all ready to...
We test this microphone, Sophie, briefly. Can I just check you hear me very well, obviously?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, Daniel.
Yay, high five to that. Great. So we are planning a fairly interactive session. We didn't want to just talk to ourselves because the idea is to have an exchange and understand our perspective from the data production world, but also we want to understand the end user world. So we have a Slido, which is kind of Mentimeter. So it's an online tool where we can actually ask you a few questions. If you can all get your phone out, if you have it, or you can also join using a laptop. And we have a first question for you, which is about understanding the challenges you can be facing in your work with regards to the use of data. So Gemma, if I can ask you to share the first Slido, please.
Bear with me a second, it's coming.
Thank you. Right, so if I can all ask you to either join using the QR code or going on slido.com and enter the code, which is 2839675. And we're asking you to answer the first question, which is, what is the biggest challenge you face in understanding and using humanitarian data or data for humanitarian action? So it's a word cloud, so ideally don't write a full paragraph. A couple of words would be fantastic. Thank you. We're giving you about 30 seconds to do that. Oh, okay. Accuracy is a big challenge, which is in a way quite relatable with today's discussion. We've got some people saying there's too little data, some missing data. Sometimes it can be confusing or conflicting, and I guess that's related to the fact there are many data producers using different methods and sources. So which one is the right one? The challenge of low data literacy in some context. I think I saw something around data privacy. Okay, that's a good point. Availability, up-to-date data, validity, and simplicity alongside accuracy seems to be the biggest topic. So maybe we can get started with our panel discussion and sharing the challenges that we face as data producers to give a slightly different perspective. So Yeven, I'm going to start with you. If you could tell us what are the challenges that your organization that you faced on people interpreting data or the data you've published.
Yeah, thank you. I think that all the things that you guys mentioned in the slide are, of course, a challenge that we face in our daily data production. But it's interesting that the case that I want to bring to our discussion is the case where we actually have less of these worries like of data availability and validity, data being up to date. Yet we still face one important challenge: is how do we share the analysis decision-making process in our data production case. So the case I want to talk quickly is the Informed Severity Index, which is a big data set that we produce at ACAPS. And if you don't know about this data set, the core idea is to allow the humanitarian stakeholders to sort of cross-compare different crises along severity dimensions. So you can have indicators like number of people in need, humanitarian, the level of severity, displacement indicators, and the like. So this is the data set that is updated monthly, like few info gaps, so maybe 5% of the info gaps are overall. We make sure it's updated as frequently as possible, as precise as possible, yet we still face a challenge. And the challenge is, how do we transfer the knowledge of decision-making process when we actually collect data for the indicators? So we have a bunch of users who were sharing this concern with us for quite a while, where they were saying, so, okay, we have your data. We see the number of people in need in X, but yet we still want to know, like, how did you guys land up on this number? So this was the challenge that we faced for quite a while, and we have to come up with what we call the justification templates, where we were adding, this is pure on a side, so it was not part of the design of our data set, but we added it because we wanted to convey the decision-making process done by our analysts when we collected the data. So I think sometimes it's also, like, just to wrap up quickly, sometimes you have everything. You have the data, you have less of info gap, you have the validity, you have a robust methodology, your composite indicators and the like, but you still face challenges that you don't observe. And in our case, it was how do we communicate the context around decision making for this data set. Thanks.
Yeah. You just want me to go?
Yes, please.
So ClearGlobal, the data that ClearGlobal is sharing is about the languages that people speak and understand. And we're doing that because typically, and certainly before we started working to curate and publish those data sets and language use maps, there was an awful lot of work on the basis of assumptions in the humanitarian sector. It's assumptions about, the nearest colonial language that everyone would understand, or that, a large regional language would be more or less understood by just about everybody. And when you dig into the data, you find out that really isn't the case.
and so we're trying to highlight language diversity, and we have a challenge when, for all the very obvious reasons of, you know, budget and capacity and so on, the answer, what people are actually asking a question about is, what is the one language or the two languages that I can use to reach people in East Africa? I'm slightly caricaturing, but you know, it's a question that's been asked. And so we try to respond by using by making the data available in our language use data platform. You can drill up or you can drill down. So you can look at the kind of the country level, you know, most spoken languages, or you can drill down to the locality or the province, for instance, that you're operating in. And what we try to do is use a mix of different formats. So we, you know, tables and charts and maps and text to highlight there is greater diversity than this here, and to flag the fact that if your first language isn't that language, then it's the people who get less education that you're going to be excluding if you're already only communicating in that language. So to help people understand, because you know, of course there are very real resource issues, but so that people can understand who you're likely to be losing if you're focusing on this particular province, but you're only using Swahili or you're only using Hausa, you're only able to do that, so that you can look at the other things, the other ways in which you can make your communication more accessible to those people for whom it's the second or third or fourth or fifth language. So, you know, using plain language, using a mix of different, you know, of audio and visual formats and text formats and so on, and allowing, to the extent possible, for some kind of facilitation by speakers of those languages in the room. I guess that's it. Am I moving it this way, or am I moving it back to you?
Jessie, over to you.
Okay, thanks. Mine's actually, I liked how you started with assumptions, because I feel like, so we work a lot with OpenStreetMap, which, if you're not familiar, is completely crowdsourced geospatial data. So anybody can edit it at any time, kind of like Wikipedia meets Google Maps. So it's very, what the data looks like, there's a lot of variety globally, also locally. It just depends, and that's with like the actual coverage of like a road and the information on top of that road, if it's paved, if it's not, the name. So one of the biggest challenges we face is people over assuming that it's good. They'll just hear about OpenStreetMap, or they'll have seen one set of data set in one country and they'll just think it's good everywhere, or the opposite, they'll just think it's bad and they just won't trust it. And there's very few people in between, which I find very interesting. So kind of similar to you is that we found that if you just start to give people an extra level of information, we've been working on things like roll-up statistics, like, well, how much coverage does this building footprints data set have, like in square kilometers, just to start getting people to realize that there is variety across the area. Because once you give people some information, I think that really helps people's brains to just kind of like drill in a little bit and be a little bit curious. But I think you're touching on something really important that we've talked about when we were planning this panel, is that, you know, we're all making decisions quickly. The humanitarian sector is very fast-paced, and when you're making decisions on what data is usable, you're really going in with either a subconscious bias or a known bias, and it's good to be able to know when it's important to be like, when do I need more information to make an educated decision. So.
Great, thank you, Jessie. Well, you've got the mic, actually. Can I ask you a follow-up question? You've already touched
Of course.
on this, but like, what are the solutions that you put in place? Like, what can you do to make the data more easily understandable by the users who are less familiar with the type of data you produce?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something we've been actually working with HGX quite a bit about, Humanitarian Data Exchange. I don't know if there's anyone in the room from there, but shout out to them. That data transparency is something that I think everyone in the sector has actually gotten better at talking about in the last year. There was, again, I think a lot of us went into this with an assumption that, is data good or bad? And then we realized very quickly, actually, with a matter of a couple months, that that's not the question we should be asking. Is it usable? And there's just no one way to say is it good or not. So if you look at HDX, there's the data grids that actually have like, we recommend this data set, but why? And just transparency on why we're recommending it. Like, is it kept up to date? Does it have good coverage? If you look at our pages for OpenStreetMap, we've just actually added tables that actually show what languages are in the data. And that helps to actually guide people to what to look for, and make it really easy. They don't have to download it and filter it themselves. And so I think other data sharing platforms are hopefully going that way as well, to actually have some information about the data set, like really readily available, and explaining the opportunities, but also the limitations and the caveats. Like, that should be readily available from data producers, but in a very flexible way, that's not assuming somebody's use case, that they can then make their own decisions. I hope that makes sense. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe over to you, Daniel. So Flowminder works with a different type of data, which is mostly mobile operated data. What do you do at Flowminder to make it easier for users to use the data?
Thanks. And I think the first thing before I would generalize is to comment on the all users have specific needs. Field practitioners, data scientists, and each user group will benefit from having their needs understood and anticipated. And there's a lot of skills out there, tools, particularly from the field of product management, that can be applied to that question. So do that. On the specifics, something I think most of us would recognize is maps. Maps are fantastic. Overlaying data with geographic information is very powerful, very intuitive to most people way of getting into data. And if maps are good, interactive maps are even better. And that's what we're doing with the Haiti Mobility Dashboard, where you can have sliders and tools which allow users to select data of interest and drill down into the area that they're concerned about. The second thing I would call out is metadata and clear communication about where data comes from, the methods which have been used to construct data, providing as much information about that as possible in non-technical, technical but not jargony language, so that people can understand that, and highlight that it's there as well. Don't bury that information. Make it prominent, make it easy to find, and encourage people to use it and tap into it. And the third tool I'd call out is pre-interpreted summaries. So you will know that you'll have data can serve a wide range of uses, but you'll anticipate that certain uses are going to be more common than others. So you can offer pre-interpreted summaries for those particular use cases. And that's what we do in Haiti as well. So we prepare preparedness reports and protracted crises reports, which highlight the implications of the data for those particular events. Good. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeven, do you want to share ACAPS perspective? I think you have a slightly different work with the bootcamp.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe just to add on what I was sharing before in the justification templates and the tools that we have been developed. So the tools, those tools are mostly kind of a passive addition to the data sets that we produce. Is just to explain how the things works to the users. But we also were thinking that, there is no perfect data set, right? So there will be always limitation. There will be always, and you guys mentioned the accuracy, validity, info gaps, and the like. And we said that maybe one of the critical aspects of our work is to partner with the users. And that's why we came up with a program which is called Humanitarian Bootcamp. So this is like a 10 weeks, literally a bootcamp of self-paced, education that we provided to the aspiring analysts or people like data producers, like that some of you guys raise your hand on. And the idea of the bootcamp was to try to teach how to make a sense, how to do a sense making from data. So this is not like a classical MOOC where we just, teach you how to do R or, Python or data analysis. There are dozens of things like that. So we didn't want to replicate that. But the idea of the bootcamp was to, in a world where there will be always issue with accuracy, there will be always issue with validity, there will be always issues that, were mentioned on the slide, how do we still make a good decisions? And that's why we thought that it's really important, not just us as a data producer to improve our tools, but but also partner with the users to kind of empower you to make a better sense making from the data that we share, of course, and from the data that our partners share. And I guess the bootcamp itself was very successful. And just as a spoiler, in 1 hour you can hear more information about the bootcamp on a dedicated session. So I'm really welcome you to join the session.
Great, thank you. So I think back to you guys for another Slido. So we'd like to hear your perspective on what matters to you most when using data. So Gemma, if I can ask you to reshare your screen, please, to launch the next Slido question. Thank you. Right, so what matters to you most when using data? So you've got 5 choices, sorry. So data completeness, data is timely, data is reliable, data is granular, and data is analyzed and presented. So interpretation, findings, and visualization included. So you have to rank them. So at the moment, actually, I can't tell what's the first one because of the screen moving, but I think data is reliable is the primary response, followed by data is timely. So we've got 22 responses. So I'm going to wait a bit more before we move to this time you've got 2 questions in a row, and then we're going to go into another question and perspective from the panelists.
Could feel the tension between 1 and 2 here. Reliable versus timely, like that's.
Yeah, reliable and timely. You guys making our life difficult, I guess.
These are also like the bigger ones, right?
Yeah. I'm going to wait a few more seconds just to see if there's a change in the trend. Right, there's 1 participant ranking, and when this person is over, Gemma, let's move on, please. Great, thank you. So this question is oversimplified in terms of wording, but we wanted to see what is more important to you. Timely data that producers have 70 or 80% confidence in, or actually you'd rather have something that is slightly less uncertain, but sorry, I've lost my train of thought. So timely data that we are fairly confident, 70, 80%, or actually having it later, but as producers, we're 100% convinced that is the best data that we can produce. And I think that one that is a no-brainer. Timely data, even though if it comes with some level of uncertainty, is preferable for humanitarian action than something that comes later, but is maybe slightly more robust. So on that note, let's ask, so maybe Jesse, we can start with you on that question. Is in a rapid and evolving humanitarian context, how can we balance the needs for timely data with the demand for granular insight? So I guess it's managing that, getting the perfect data, but also maybe the best resolution, even though you've got that pressure from the users to get something out there fairly quickly.
Yeah, thank you. And that's really interesting from the audience. So I always look at data quality and completeness as a continuum, but that doesn't mean that the end of the continuum is the ideal for what decision you're making. So I think probably most people in the room are familiar with kind of the disaster response cycle. And we'll skip from like the preparedness and planning to the actual event, right? It really depends what activity and action you're doing on that moment. If you're already on the ground, you're just going to use what data you have, right? Like there's no going back and questioning things, but there's also a lot of people just big picture understanding the size of the impact. And you don't actually really need super detailed data for that. And that's okay. It's better to have something that's indicative, like where is the impact as opposed to like specific houses, right? You need to know what side of town, what side of the country, kind of depending on the size of the event. And so for things like OpenStreetMap, we do a lot of preparedness work and anticipatory action to try and get that data there. But unfortunately, once there's an event, it's going to take a very long time to get that good data. So that's when it's important to know what data you're using and to make sure you're communicating that. And I actually find on a map that's actually it's a lot easier to do that type of thing because you can aggregate to different spatial levels, especially if you're mapping information. So not like infrastructures or roads. I look at a lot of damage maps. I lead our conflict program, so unfortunately that's a lot of what we look at. And if you take damage data, you don't need to have that individual building right away for a lot of use cases. You know, you're actually working on saving lives, you're looking at lighting up resources, so you can aggregate that to like a district level, and that takes out any of that like the uncertainty within that district, because it's more important to find that pattern. But then as you go on and you're actually planning in-person action, you do need to know that building. But by then the data will have hopefully caught up. So hopefully.
Great, thank you. Yevhen, can I have your perspective on this, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, my perspective is that there is definitely no silver bullet solution to this challenge. And, you know, we tried different approaches. So we tried approaches when we have, you know, data triangulation. We try to use alternative data to sort of supplement our own information. We try to use machine learning a lot. So, you know, I guess you are familiar that these days, you know, if you come to the conference and don't see AI and machine learning, you probably raise a flag, something wrong here. So we tried machine learning, of course. We tried to do the you know, data imputation with machine learning, but I think there is, and that's why we launched the bootcamp. You know, the more we talk, the more I think this idea was so powerful in itself, because there will be always situations where you will have you know, missing values, or you will have information that is the data just doesn't exist. So, for example, in our machine learning case, for some types of crises that like natural hazards, you can use the historical data to sort of predict the future values. But for types of crises like conflict, there are so, you know, stochastic, there are so many idiosyncrasies that it's really hard to chime in and understand. So like, how do I use, like, you know, the data from the crisis X and crisis Y? It was literally impossible. So I think this is like kind of a rhetorical question in itself. And at ACAPS, what we are trying to do more and more is to try to come up with the solutions where we partner with our users. And of course, we start investing more into like understanding the user needs. And there are so many users, like the colleagues mentioned. So this is the area where we now try to invest more resources and to understand, you know, like moving beyond the data, how can we create an approach that will feed better the needs of different user groups. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So now I'm going to come to you, Ellie. If you could share your perspective around like the recommendation that you have for users who cannot find what we call the ideal data, if that even exists, or that users that work in a data scarce environments. So what would you recommend for them in such context?
Thank you. Thanks. And of course, this happens a lot because there's not always great language use data out there. What there is increasingly on our language use data platform. So start there. If it's not there, you have an issue. But we have a great use case for this in Northeast Nigeria, because there are about 500 languages spoken in Nigeria. And that's really not a useful number for running a country. And so the Nigerian government does not collect that data on the languages that people speak and understand. It's not going to help them. It's a perspective. But for humanitarians, obviously, it's absolutely vital. When we first went to try and work on this in 2017 in Northeast Nigeria, nobody was collecting the data. Pretty much at the time, our evaluation showed that humanitarians were using English and Hausa, which of the 5 official languages in Nigeria is the one that's spoken in Northeast Nigeria. But yeah, we from simply with conversations with humanitarians, we were saying, well, no, we are having gaps. We are finding when we're doing focus group discussions, there are people we can't talk to. We can't even hear what their question was, let alone respond to it. And we can't even say we're going to go back and do something about it, because we have on our staff, we have Hausa speakers and English speakers, period. And we worked with IOM's DTM team. They say, okay, well, it's, you know, our methodology isn't great for collecting any kind of, you know, statistically representative they were using key informant interviews, they could get something. And so from that, we were able to see that actually there were about 30 or 40 languages that were regularly being reported by IDP communities to DTM. And we used that as a basis to say to Impact Reach at the time, you know, can we not get these questions into an MSNA, into a multi-sector needs assessment? There are clearly gaps here that people are seeing, but we don't have the data on it. And so it did get in, and when we were able to get it in, we were able to see that first language Hausa speakers accounted for about 31% of affected people in the 3 most affected states. And yeah, there were another 30 or 40 languages behind. And there's a practical action that's possible on top of that. So when we had the data about, you know, the prevalence, that's the wrong word, isn't it? You know what I mean? It's not a disease, it's a language. About roughly how many people were speaking languages that weren't currently being served, as ClearGlobal, we were able to build up our own capacity to support communicating in those languages. And we added another 8 languages to our capacity, which took it to covering 31% of people in their first language to 83%. We're able to support, you know, a whole range of organizations to do that. So I would say start with kind of where you are and collect the data that you can, and move out from there, because you can then get to a stage where we have some pretty decent data at LGA level, so you know, admin 2 level for Northeast Nigeria, and you can look and see, okay, well actually if I'm working in this LGA, I'm going to need Burapabir is my first language, and the next 2 would be Shura and Fulfulde. So Hausa doesn't actually register there at all. I would just say as well, obviously our thing is language, so that's what we were looking and asking for. But in any organization's programs, you actually need to know which languages the people you're trying to serve speak and understand. Otherwise, you know, your needs assessment isn't going to work, because you're only going to be hearing from the better educated members of the dominant clan, tribe, caste, ethnic community that are in that affected community. So start by asking, and we have a set of recommended questions. If you can only ask one, ask what is the main language you use at home, and if you get it into your data collection with communities, if you collect that data from your program participants, then you can start to see where there are gaps. You can start to see, for instance, if you are able to check against what data's out there, for instance, you know, the MSNA data, you can start to see, okay, well, there should be Burapabir speakers here, but they're not showing up. Or the outcomes for Waha speakers seem to be much poorer than the outcomes for Shua speakers. So what can we do about that? So I would say you can always get the data for your own programs, and you can then share it with others, and you can start, if you're seeing gaps and you speak to others and they're also seeing gaps, then you can use that to push for the collective data collection. So that was a bit of a long answer.
We're still on time, don't worry.
Okay,
Okay, thank you. But Daniel, I'm looking at you now to have a not too long answer. If you could actually share
when I was a boy.
This is my boss. I have to be careful about what I say. But so could you tell us what your recommendations are when users work in a data scarce environment?
Sure, and I'll echo the comment that ideal data in our sector, in humanitarian and development work, I think, but certainly in humanitarian work, is a unicorn. Rarely exists. So what do we do? And obviously this plays into what Flowminder does a lot, and leveraging proxy data is kind of the key message. I try and look for data which is already being generated passively, perhaps by other organizations, and we focus on particularly on data generated by mobile operators. So they collect huge volumes of data for billing purposes. So that's the intent for which it's collected, but can be adapted using the right methods, adjusting for the biases in the data, so it's acknowledge its weaknesses, but they can be accounted for to provide rapid, up-to-date, near real-time information on population movement, which can be super useful. The second point is to be open. Be open about the weaknesses or the data gaps which are informing a decision, informing a policy. Recognize that being open about the weaknesses in a data set adds to the value of its data, not detracts from it. That's important. It can be counterintuitive. showing something's weaknesses helps people use it better. And I'll keep it short. So the last one I would say is just work with uncertainty. Learn how to work with uncertainty and help your users think about working with uncertainty more. And I just think a great tool for doing that is best case, worst case, more like most likely scenarios. By presenting data in that way, you automatically encourage people to think about a range rather than focusing on, which we see everywhere for as long as I've worked in this sector, or even with data, people focus on the point of the curve, the most likely outcome, whereas best case, worst case, most likely scenario-based planning encourages people to think about a range of outcomes. Good, thanks.
Great, thank you, Daniel. So I think we have another Slido for you guys now, before we move into the core of the discussion, which is around actually data uncertainty. So if you can all get your phone back or laptop, and Gemma, if I can ask you to reshare your screen, please. And the question is around, what is the biggest factor in building trust between data producers and data users? We've got something around transparency, past accuracy and reliability of sources, the channels to communicate feedback, end user involvement, and independent verification of data. It looks like at the moment, transparency about the data collection and the way uncertainty is communicated seems to be the most important factor.
So the first answer.
We'll let you be the judge of that. I'm going to give you a few more seconds. I'm going to try to speed up the conversation a tiny bit more for the panelists coming after that, because I really don't want to eat into the Q&A sessions, because we really want to be able to answer any questions you have. So if we can try and not speed up what you say, but maybe shorten it.
She's looking at me.
Right, Yevhen, shall we start with you? Can you, no, actually, Ellie, let's start with you.
I'll do my very best.
Maybe you should go last if you speak too much. But anyway, so how does uncertainty vary between data sources, and how can this be used complementarily?
So on language use data, there's the big issue that a lot of governments don't collect it, but those that do collect it don't necessarily collect it in a way that is usable for humanitarians. The great thing is that where there is that data, it remains reasonably static until once you've got the data, you'll have census data, and you can say, okay, people in this region speak these 4 languages, for instance. But then there's an emergency, and then everybody moves, and the fact that we can't connect those two is problematic. So basically, we're balancing the certainty of the big data sets, the DHS, the mixed data, government census data, against the usability of data like the MSNAs that's collected for operational uses. We did an assessment a few years ago of 88 inform ranked countries, and found that only 24 of them had actually usable data on the languages that people speak and understand. So for instance, what we do is we score data by a whole host of different characteristics, but the one that will be different from other people in the group is we look at the form of the question that was asked. So if you ask about the main language you use at home, you get a useful answer. But take an example like Tanzania. The questions in the government census are around how well you speak Swahili in English, or your literacy in English. And then there are other languages all lumped together. So you don't get any sense of if people can speak Swahili, what those languages are, or where each of the other languages are spoken. What we do is try to pick the most reliable. Sorry, we score it. We take our aggregate of the scores for how recent it is, the form of the question, etc. And we present a score, but we pick the one with the best score. And that's the one that shows up on our platform.
Thank you. Can you pass the mic to Daniel?
I can.
Thank you.
I just keep going. Okay, rather than work through every data type and talk about its strengths and weaknesses, I'll focus on mobile operator data and survey data. I mean, survey data is gold standard very often, but it can be slow. It can be expensive to collect survey data, and very often the contexts that we're interested in are dangerous. You know, so on the ground field exercises can be challenging. Mobile operator data is available in near real time and can provide information on movement of subscribers, but it underrepresents very often the elderly, very often the very young, and there's other biases in that data as well. It can tell you about where movement is happening, but it doesn't tell you why. So you lose that context. So, you know, what do? You combine these data types, you know, triangulate with these and others that I might list, and you know, there are methods that we've developed for adjusting for the biases in mobile operator data using survey data, so that you can provide very rapid, near real-time information on population movement, accounting for the biases in that mobile operator data, which is fantastic. So, and as well as triangulation, I would also say continue to use data types independently. So we were doing some work in Iraq, and we could see subscribers moving through a desert region away from Mosul. This is back during ISIS, and that was a trigger for a field exercise. You know, there was no ability to adjust for the biases in that data. We didn't have any way of doing that. But we were able to work with partners who were then able to commission, you know, investigation people to go out to that area and find out how many families that represented, and then provide support to them. Good. So triangulation and using them independently.
Great, thank you. Jessie, do you want to answer that question too, please?
Sorry, just got lost in your
How does
answers.
uncertainty vary between data sources, and how can they be used complementarily?
Thank you. So for spatial data, I think it's actually easier to compare because it's a bit more apples to apples, a road's a road. So that is what OpenStreetMap strength is that you're not going to have changeable data. So for us, it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning with increasing transparency of that data so it's comparable. So it's not enough for us to say like this percentage of populated places has a name. Other data sets are going to have to use that too. So that's for that level. But then you get to what I think everyone else here is actually more familiar with, is that information that is tied to that location, be it population, language. I think that is where it gets a bit more nuanced. But I actually think that putting it on a map actually really helps to see those differences. But I think that expands to other data visualization, that understanding, the strengths and weaknesses. And I think I liked what maybe you said about it's important to understand the weaknesses. It makes it better. And I don't even, I don't know if they're weaknesses, because it's just differences, right? Because everything's going to have different weaknesses. And through data visualization, understanding what the difference is, that's when you become an informed user, and it depends on what your use case is of like what you can compromise in the data and what you can't. So yeah.
Great, thank you. So if you can keep the mic, and I'm going to come to you with the last question, and all of you have a chance to answer. So what are some of the practical ways to present uncertainty? So we've been talking a lot about the different ways of working, but I think what we want to know is like, how can you bear that into account so that the data remain actionable and maintain that trust? So what's hot approach?
Back to be the spatial person on this panel, and to build on what I was saying before, is that I think maps are very interesting because on one hand, people take them as truth. Everyone here has looked at a map, just I guarantee it, right? So they kind of there's a level of familiarity with map looking at spatial data that is not true for language data. So and that's a strength and weakness too, right? Because then I think you can build on people's familiarity with their environment, what's around them. But then you do have to caveat it, like what is the uncertainty? And I think that there's no data that I would say is like 100%. Even I think we think that like, oh, the gold standard is a field data verification. but is that always going to be, perfect? Probably not. It depends on your GPS, but it also depends on who's collecting the data, which not to say that they're wrong. It's going to be different. So I think communicating variance and always noting that something's an estimate. So I think kind of like meeting people where they are with data literacy. I know that's a word I think we all have like mixed feelings about in the room, but showing that the difference over time too. That's another thing, not just between data sources, but data sets change. That they change a lot in OpenStreetMap actually. So showing that there's there's more buildings in the area, like was there actually an increase in population? Probably not. Explaining why there's change, I think that can help.
Great, thank you. Can you pass the mic to Daniel, please? Do you want me to repeat the question?
Yes.
What are some practical ways to present uncertainty? How do you do it at Flowminder?
Good. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so understanding uncertainty in a statistical sense is pretty challenging in the context of Haiti or DRC. So how do we mitigate that? And yeah, bit of repetition here. Clearly communicate the methods used to prepare data. Clearly communicate what input data is being used. All of this helps. Sharing metadata, etc. I've got scenario-based thinking in my mind, and I see Beth's comment in the chat, who's called me out on the kind of best case, worst case scenarios point. And I recognize Beth's point that creates a kind of tendency to focus on those scenarios. And I agree, I think, with the direction of Beth's comment that encouraging people to think about a range of outcomes is the key thing, which is important. So maybe I emphasize that. And confidence intervals are a way of doing that, obviously, with data. So when we can prepare confidence intervals, the challenge I've seen is that people don't always understand what a confidence interval means, or they disregard it. You present two maps, that's the most likely, that's the confidence interval. They just ignore the second one. So thinking about ways in which you can encourage people to think about what that means, as well as presenting confidence intervals themselves, is helpful. And almost returning to the first point I made and to the first question, just engaging decision makers. So data providers should be talking to decision makers. And obviously that's so that the data providers can understand the needs of the decision makers and what decisions are being taken, how data is being used, and then factor that into the design of data products. But it's bidirectional. Also, data users benefit from understanding more of the context of how that data is provided, and that's facilitated by good open conversation. Good, thanks.
Great, thank you. Ellie, do you want to share your perspective? And I understand ClearGlobal have recently released a language data use platform, so maybe you could share some of the practicalities there as well.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so we're working on, we've been publishing data language use maps and particularly through HDX, the interoperable data sets for language use for a long time now. But the language use data platform is it's a more user-friendly tool, partly because we've been working with some of the users like Flowminder and others to get feedback, as you were saying, Daniel, on how people want to access that data. In terms of the uncertainty, what it does, as I was saying, we score it for granularity and timeliness and the size of the data set and the form of the questions, and then we pick the best scoring data set, whether that's Afrobarometer or mix or the census, and that is the one that you'll see on the map, and you can drill down, you can drill up. But you can also go and dig into the data sets. So the answer is there, that what we think is the best answer to your question is right there in front of you, and the easiest access. But for people who want to see, okay, what else was out there, that's possible to dig in as well.
Great, thank you. Yeven, do you want to share ACAPS perspective? So you have the last word on presenting uncertainty from ACAPS perspective.
Sure,
thank you.
Sure. Maybe I just start with that a bit maybe different perspective of uncertainty we discussed so far. We actually at ACAPS think that this uncertainty is an opportunity, so we embrace it, and we actually created a product based on an uncertainty, which is a global risk list. So I don't think personally that uncertainty is a problem per se, because like if whenever you take the introductory class on statistic or econometrics, you guys will be introduced to the concept of linear model. And half of a linear model and half of assumptions are built on the error term, which is basically an uncertainty. Does it prevent the research community of running linear regressions? No, they actually do it quite a lot, and this is the basic workhorse of every academic research you can see. So I think that what colleagues were sharing are what are the valid points for ACAPS as well. We are trying to create a feedback loop between the data producers and the data consumers to understand how the data is used in the field, how the data is applied in decision making, and when we can help with making sense of those data through some of our programming. So I'm completely echo of those instruments, guys, that you shared. This is the same kind of approach that we feel resonate with the users a lot. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So I think now we're going to move to the Q&A. So if I can just ask you to raise your hand and I'll come with the mic. And online, if you can write down your question in the chat. So in terms of asking question, if I can ask you to state your name, your organization, your question, and if needed, your context in 1 or 2 sentences. But so everyone has a chance to ask question. Do not go into a whole 10-minute speech. That's all right. Thank you. Anyone wants to go after that lovely introduction? Or if there's any questions. I didn't see you. Thank you. Or if you can say who you want to answer as well, if you want to direct your question to a specific panelist.
Okay, it's not to a specific panelist, so it's to maybe to for all of them. Hi, I'm Sukanya. I'm from Highgate, Heidelberg Institute of Geoinformation Technology. And my question is more on the data availability science. So we know that a high resolution satellite data is available, but there are license issues which makes it not usable for a lot of humanitarian open source, open data applications. And this is a big bottleneck right now. And how do you see that? Do you have any views? Like, do you think this would change and help data producers to kind of generate more data for the humanitarian use cases?
I guess that would have to go to me. Oh man, that's a great question. And satellite imagery is, it's it's a tough one. No, I don't think it's going to change, unfortunately. I was optimistic for a while, but I think that was maybe a bit naive. What I am optimistic about is better coordination between humanitarians. I don't think we can expect the private sector, in which most satellites are private sector, to change their business. They're going to be for profit. That is the way most of the world is going, including governments. But I think there is an opportunity there, even if it's not the opportunity we want or is that ideal. Because you're right, satellite imagery is one of the most important things when it comes to data accuracy and coverage and knowing what's going on. But I do think there are satellite providers that are interested in humanitarian work genuinely. Sometimes that changes, there's change in leaderships, but there's enough of them out there and there's enough of a need. So, I mean, my call to the humanitarian sector is to work together on that and to negotiate together, because I think that that's one of the best examples of when data sharing will help with that confidence and putting everyone on the even playing field. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Any other question? Yeah.
Yes, so I'm Michael from Palladium, working for the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Thank you, fascinating summary. And there's obviously a lot of change has been kind of addressed or worked on in the last 10 years. It's come leaps and bounds in terms of how the humanitarian sector's dealt with a lot of these problems. But one that seems to be kind of growing, not new, but growing in intensity, is fundamentally communicating uncertainty and then organizations or information's impartiality, neutrality being questioned. So it's kind of this problem that comes alongside what you're talking about. How do you also have not only confidence in the data, but then communicate to people using it the confidence that this is the right source to use, even with all the flaws, which transparency should kind of combat, but sometimes that can itself be a bit counterproductive in some of these contexts. So, I mean, I'm understanding a big question, but really curious to get anyone's thoughts on that.
I'm going to pick a name if you don't choose between yourself. Daniel, please. You're
I
smiling
don't
at me.
know. It's a great question. It's a great question. That tension between advocacy and, I mean, I think this is what you're asking, that advocacy, you should be using this data. It's fantastic. You should stop taking decisions based on political influence and, you know, whatever else, and be more data driven. But by the way, you know, it's got these weaknesses, and you've really got to get across those. And one of the other tensions that comes to mind when thinking about that is, I'm going to use that phrase, data literacy or whatever. You know, the skills of the people that you're talking to are something to hold in mind, or the familiarity with uncertainty when you dig into those weaknesses, because you can significantly undermine their confidence in the data. So I think it really varies by context. I think it's a skill, kind of a degree of kind of understanding the humans, understanding their interests that you need to drill into in order to be able to reach good outcomes there. So maybe that is the conclusion, holding that tension in mind.
Maybe one positive example, we work on a very specific piece, but it was a piece of work we did in Venezuela, where indigenous language speakers, indigenous communities were concerned that they simply weren't represented in the maps, and that was about how census data was collected, what census data was collected, and it was very hard for us. There was very, very old data that said something about language, and there was slightly more recent data that said something about ethnicity, and mapping ethnicity is a whole, you know, kind of ethical minefield. And what we did was work with linguists and researchers and academics from those communities to review those two data sets together and say, okay, what of this is still works 20 years later? How far can you actually map language to ethnicity? How comfortable are you without putting a map out that shows language? You know, what's your assessment of the risks around that? And we ended up producing a map that they were really happy with. You know, this is a group of different communities of some of the bigger Mayan languages in Venezuela, and which gave them a much richer, a much more accurate picture of how you need to be communicating with people if you actually want to listen to people who are affected by what's going on in Venezuela. So talking to in that case, we could talk to the people who were most at risk potentially from the data, and also had the best first-hand understanding of what was accurate, and use them to kind of ground truth the government's data in that case.
Great, thank you. So we also have a question in the chat, which is, how do you communicate the limitation of data use for your own data, so over time and space? So I think I'd like to hear from maybe not all of you, but like maybe geospatial language and mobile data, because they have different limitations. Yeven, shall we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think we briefly mentioned that from the ACAPS perspective, we try to incorporate the sort of a thought process, or like the methodology approach that we use to create the data sets. And in our case, I guess we're a bit blessed because we work mostly with the secondary data and less of primary data. So we have a bit less of the challenges that the colleagues shared. But in our case, it's like more a challenge of interpretability of the data, and how do we create a bridge between the primary data and secondary data in our data sets. So I think what we're doing is basically an approach that we call human in the loop, where we have always the analyst community who sort of chime in and try to decode the decision-making process or the analytical process that they put together when they were, constructing these data sets. And then it's up to our team then to make sure we can communicate this as most effectively as possible to the users. And I see some of the users are here, so I hope we are doing a good job in that. If not, guys, just raise your hand. Thanks.
I don't have a lot to say about this one, to be honest. We don't collect the data. We encourage people to collect usable data, and to do that, we make our standard questions available in a whole range of languages in ODK kind of ready format to encourage that data collection happens. And we do a lot of work with IOM, WFP, and Reach and others to ensure that those questions or some version of those questions goes into their question bank, so they're readily available to colleagues who are wanting to use them in the field. But we don't collect it.
Yeah. So for OpenStreetMap data, because it's crowdsourced, it's never going to be authoritative, and that is the disclaimer. And this is a very simple answer. We put a disclaimer on everything that while we do have people checking it, and I hope this doesn't freak anyone out, anyone at any point could go and change it after it's been checked, it was horrifying when I started it. But actually, it's the consensus of the commons though, right? Like I think everyone here is probably familiar with Wikipedia. If something changes that's horrific, it will change back. So it's okay. It's actually better than you think. But because of that, it goes back to, I think, what you were saying, that you need to know how the data was collected. So for things like an administrative boundary, never use OpenStreetMap. That has to be authoritative. It's better not to have a boundary than have a crowdsourced boundary, especially in the sensitive areas we work in. Can you imagine? Anyone could just move the border. I won't name any countries, but I'm sure we all just filled in that sentence, right? So yeah, read the disclaimer. I know that they're on every map and in every data set, but sometimes you need that little it's crowdsourced, right? And that's how you know the limitations. If it is something that's authoritative, then I also encourage users and data producers to be a little bit communicative on what those are. Things it's amazing, speaking of boundaries, how they're not that set in some parts of the world. So just kind of looking at it too and making your own informed decision. If you just look at a data set, I think if you know where it came from, you can kind of know yourself if there's the information about it, what is the limitation. So yeah.
Good, thanks. I think a lot of sensible things have been said on this already. Flowminder very often serves other data organizations. So we don't serve hundreds or thousands of users. I hope we will one day, but we serve a small number of maybe UN organizations, government organizations, decision-making organizations, which means that we can think about general tools, confidence intervals, metadata, clear communication, etc. But the specific tools that you can apply when there's a small number of users, which is getting together in person, sitting next to somebody and talking to them and having rich conversations, helping them understand, the limitations, strengths, and not so strengths of your data to avoid weaknesses. It's kind of obvious, but it's important. I remember we worked in Mozambique. We met with the members of the disaster management agency there and had 2 days going through the data and really helping them understand where it came from and how to make the best of it. And we were able to design better products for them as a result of that strong engagement. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more question in the rooms?
Lana Salapanova, PHK Ukraine. So maybe a successful example can be collaboration with national NGO, strong national NGO with high meal department and for example, NGO platform who can give all information and check all information for international NGO from meal departments and give all this information. This collaboration show us that we can prove and check all information from government, from international NGO, for UN agency, because all data in reality till now it's needs this check. And using national strong NGO, national NGO inland with strong real department and capacity, for example, capacity to be in front line or in dangerous area can be also successful example how to get information, check all this information and give all this information for database and analysis gaps. So thank you.
Do you have a, no, sure. Do you have a specific question? It was more.
Question, maybe this collaboration is maybe collaboration with national, local actors who have capacity can be also opportunity to get all this information and check all this information.
How do you work with local actors? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll comment on that very quickly. I mean, one of our I would say a flagship from our side where we're trying to do this is our work in Ghana. So we work with the Ghana Statistical Service. So we act as an interlocutor where we work with a mobile operator, hopefully more than one in the future. And we're supporting them to produce statistics or incorporate mobile operator data into the statistics that they are producing. And there's work to go in that project and that partnership. But obviously, you know, they're in a great position to bring in other data sets to contextualize the information that they're receiving that we are not able to sitting in the UK. Yeah, so that's great.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for it. So with OpenStreetMap, as I was saying, anyone can edit it. And one of my favorite things is that everyone can bring something to OpenStreetMap. That you hear a lot about global volunteers going and tracing buildings after a flood. But when you're actually getting to that second level of detail, you have to be on the ground. I don't know what towns are called. I don't know what streets are called. I don't know where the hospitals are. And that's where we get more dedicated projects and team members from that area. And then it's actually really cool to see those people come together to this global data community. And we've been doing actually a lot, which is kind of inspired by Clear, to better parse out things like languages, working together, learning that structure, because there's nothing else like OpenStreetMap where it's a global data schema. It's not a great one, but like there's nothing else that everyone's kind of feeding into, but you need that different level of expertise, and one of them is local. And that's also not to say that they could also do everything, but when there's a crisis, I actually think there's a strength in kind of splitting out what different people can do. So it's a really interesting thing to see come together, and it makes the data better for it. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, crowdsourcing is checking of the data is something that we're really keen to add to our language use data platform. At the moment, you can upload a data set, you can submit a data set, which then gets reviewed. But we would love to bring in the crowdsourcing. We have a community of over 100,000 linguists speaking, you know, hundreds of different language pairs who are already out there and engaging on this, that we would love to bring in. And then being able to collaborate with NGOs at local level, absolutely. We've done that so far more in a qualitative way. So we work, for instance, with Patan Development Organization in Pakistan after the big floods in 2022, and they helped us to understand what wasn't getting through in terms of, you know, the early warning messages or the information about compensation or even kind of public health and so on, because they're in communities and able to get that feedback and support a more qualitative understanding that we can then share with others. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess in our case, because most of the products we create are global products, and when you create a big product that sort of try to monitor different, you know, crises across the globe, the scale is important, and it's really hard to. Of course, we can't go to partner with everyone, NGO on the national or local level, but what we're trying to do here is to leverage technology. So most of the time, the sources, they will be in a local language. So in Ukraine, if you go to the National Statistical Office, the interface, they probably have English these days, but the major one will be still in Ukrainian. So the question is, how can an analyst who speaks, for example, English and X language that of his or her native language, how we can access this information rapidly? And that's where we're using artificial intelligence to sort of like translate all this information. So we have a system that's called Sophia that we use as a tool for our analysts to monitor crisis information in different sources on a global level 24/7. And this tool supports translation from 70 plus languages, including Ukrainian, for example. And that makes the data more accessible to our analysts. So it's kind of a proxy to what we were asking for, but in our case, we have to do it to use technology just because the scale is huge.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from you.
Hello, good morning. Thank you. Thanks for the great presentation. I think my question goes to Ellie. You mentioned that you have been collecting, or some of the data that you use for the mapping is ethnicity and language data. And I didn't know this organization before, but amazing. I've just been looking at the kind of work that you do. So I'm from Somalia, and working with an NGO called Evidence for Change. And one of the work that we do is setting up community-based mortality surveillance system. And as part of that work, we collect ethnicity as well as language information. And we have been experiencing resistance, not necessarily from the affected populations that we collect the data from, but from people working with NGOs as well as the government telling us, why do you need this information? So my question for you is, have you been experiencing that kind of resistance from areas where you work? How did you convince people that it's necessary to collect that? And how are those local partners within areas where you work been using that kind of information? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I should stress that we don't typically map or curate or share ethnicity data because of the risks, which are obviously very, very context specific, of encouraging discrimination, violence, conflict on that basis. So it's one of the things that we have not, that one case in Venezuela was one where we very carefully worked with local organizations and local specialists to make sure that we were interpreting the ethnicity data accurately. And so what we published was a language use map, not an ethnicity map. This is a real tension always, and there are some organizations that have been in the past reluctant to share data with us because they were afraid that we were going to put people at risk, because there is often such a close tie between ethnicity and language. We developed some safeguards. So we have an internal review where we're trying to look at what the risks are of sharing the data, sharing data around language. I'm looking at the recent conflict history and conflict context, trying to understand that. We only publish at the lowest level of granularity as admin 2, so you couldn't say people in this village, this language. And we developed a methodology for organizations collecting the data to review the risk, which is basically about talking to local people about what their assessment of the risk might be. When internally we review against those risks, and we do not publish data where we feel that it is a risk. I know that in Somalia there has been an awful lot of debate about this. Minority rights group and some of their Somali partners have done some really interesting work to look at the fact that minority clans are often simply not represented in the data. And so they've done some interesting work to invite people from minority clans to answer questions about their clan membership, or to answer questions about language. In Somalia, the questions that have got into the MSNA, for instance, have been really valuable. They've shown that my Somali speakers, they're not speakers of standard Somali, of Maha Somali, are more likely to say that they've been denied assistance than speakers of other languages. They've seen that users of Somali Sign Language are surveyed, have almost all replied that they don't feel able to influence site level decisions. So I would say that we do not try to persuade people that they have to collect this data. It has to be locally owned. There has to be a local assessment of risk. We can't do it sitting, wherever we do. I sit in Manchester. What do I know? Where it has been gathered, it can be incredibly useful, and we advocate for that to be used. But the expertise comes from you and comes from other Somali NGOs to say, okay, this is what's going to be useful. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Ellie. We've got time for one more question before we wrap up. So I can see in the chat there is a question around whether the learning discussed are applicable to environmental data, and asking us to meet them at some point this week. So John, I'm going to say we have a stand. Most of us if not all of us. So you can come and meet us. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I will very quickly give an anecdotal answer to this because it was fun, and I found out last week, if that's okay, that I mean, this actually isn't breaking news to environmental science and to weather, but it's news to me that it's I understand that it's possible to improve weather predictions by using signal strength between towers and a mobile operators network. And so I'm very excited to learn more about this personally. I think there's more thinking here than I'm much aware about. And clearly, because of our interest in mobile operator data, talking to mobile operators about whether or not they collect this data so that we can inform this particular use case is quite exciting. Thanks.
That is very exciting. That is really cool. Yeah, I saw that question in the chat and got excited because I realized one thing we have not talked at all about here, which is really important, is anticipatory action and how it ties to forecasts. And I know there's different types of forecasts and there's different environmental data is a huge thing, but I do think it's important to speak to the point of a forecast is that certainty. It is baked in. We've all seen a weather forecast, and be that short term or long term. And I think that it's such an interesting thing because people are very familiar with that probability. But I think that we need to grow as a sector and probably a world to be more data informed. And how do you actually make a decision when you know that uncertainty? Like, what's that threshold? And yeah, that's not something we talked about today, but it is important. And I wish I had more to say about it, except for that it's something that maybe is a whole topic of a next panel. And yeah, I think any of us would love to find you. So yeah, thanks.
One last question, maybe. I don't want to stand between you and your coffee break, which is one more, and then we wrap up, and you're free to go. Yes.
Thank you. So Rizik Honde works as an economist at the FCDO. It's a bit more of a forward-looking question, primarily for ACAPS and Ellie as well. So you mentioned the fact that you primarily work with secondary data, which relies on a lot of sort of primary data sources, acknowledging the funding situation that a lot of your primary data sources are sort of going through. How do you foresee sort of that sort of bridge in their funding affecting the products going forwards?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I think we're in a situation where we are thinking about this. We are in a moment where the impact of let's say, the changes that were happening for the last couple of weeks is still being anticipated. So we can't for sure now say that, XYZ kind of information sources will not be available. We actually did a few analysis for the HDX data and ReFab data, and my colleague Chiara, just sitting literally here in front of you, she was spearheading this analysis a lot, and we are seeing that the impact is not yet there. So when you look at the number of, and actually OSHA just recently published their report on the state of the data, and they try to do the kind of similar analysis where they projected this is high level vulnerability data sets, this is medium, and blah and blah and blah and blah. So we are thinking here. I think it's yet to be decided, but we will be definitely looking into using the sources that we didn't use before. And it probably will imply that we will have to adjust the methodologies that we use to create our data sets and look into the alternatives. And the alternatives could be something that we were discussing here, like the satellite data, mobile operator data, whatever data. In our case, the critical challenge is the scale that I just mentioned briefly, because we have to cover the whole globe. So we can't just, we talk to different partners at some point, but it's really hard to find a partner who could provide you data at the scale that we need. And, probably the only data that really provided you the scale we need is satellite data. But then this question is that satellite data is a good proxy for, number of people in need, for example. So it's a great question. We don't have a solution yet, but we are working on a solution. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we are also still waiting to see where the chips fall to some extent, and we're working our way through the next 30 countries. So at the moment we have 30 countries online on this new language use data platform, and we're in the process of adding the next 30. So that keeps us off the streets for a bit. I think there is concern that there's going to be less MSNA data coming through. And if that's the case, that's not going to help us in enriching those more static kind of government sources. Obviously, the loss of DHS is a big blow as well. I hope that over time, as things settle and organizations figure out how to work differently in the new environment, that collectives, whether it's clusters or groups of like-minded organizations, are going to see a value in collecting what data they can and sharing that, and we will figure out how we then make that usable and accessible to others. But yeah, unfortunately, a really good question. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we're pretty much at time, and I think to wrap up the session, I would like to ask each of the panelists in 30 seconds or less, if you could share the one takeaway. So if there is one thing you want the audience to remember from your perspective today around data communication, data uncertainty, or the tech. So I think all of us use AI at some level. Anything around this technology, data uncertainty you would like the audience to take away? I'm gonna. Well, Ellie, please go ahead. You've got the mic.
Sorry, I was What is the main language you use at home?
I call on everybody as a data producer and a data user to take that one extra step, as we were saying earlier, to communicate and then to read about the source of the data. I think it's really important, and I think that everything after that will follow. I think you'll caveat it, you'll know what where it came from, and I really think it would help. And I know it's hard in the humanitarian sector, but I think that's there. I think we could do it.
Good, thanks. I would say that as the amount of money available to do the work that we need to do is apparently falling, but the needs are increasing, that continue to look for making the best use of data which is already existing, it's cost effective, and I clearly champion mobile operator data as being an untapped source of value for the type of work we do. Thanks.
Yeah, I think the last one may be a bit funny, but don't over rely on AI. So many people in different rooms will be selling you AI, how AI will, help in this political kind of crisis that we face now. But we are using AI quite substantially, and we know that there are certain limitations, and you still need humans, and you still need to make a sense making from the data.
Great, thank you. It's a really good wrap up. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your interaction. Thank you for people online. And Gemma, thank you as well for moderating the conversation on Zoom for us. So I think you are free to go. We are going to be around either on the stand at the exhibition space. We're going to be here for a bit. Grab us for coffee if you have any more questions, because I know a few people raised their hand, but we're running out of time. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.